So this session is about standards development, and FORCE-11 is, you might call it a pre-standards development organization. That is, it's an incubator for new forms of scholarly communication. Before you can have standards, you have to have something in existence that people are working together on. You have to have the creativity before you have the refinement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. And I'll also sort of drop a sidebar at the beginning. So I work at the Mass General Hospital in the Alzheimer's Center. I'm an assistant professor of neurology, and my training is in computer science. Why the heck am I interested in any of this? And I'll tell you at the end of the talk. So FORCE-11 is three things. It's a community of scholars, librarians, all of those sort of job titles or categories that are associated with producing and consuming scholarly information. Scholars, librarians, archivists, informaticians, publishers, and funders, so I should also say financing it. And the aim of FORCE-11 is to facilitate improved knowledge creation and sharing through digital technology. Notice I said creation and sharing, not just distributing and making it available, but actually creating it. So that's an important point. So our aim is to actually make the knowledge creation activities of scholars easier as well. And it's a neutral space in which people who are interested in creating innovation in scholarly communication can work together on projects starting very, very, very far upstream. So the history is that FORCE-11 was founded in August of 2011 at a place called Schloss Dagstuhl in Germany. Does anybody ever been to Schloss Dagstuhl? It's an old castle. It's and that was formerly also used as a monastery, and the German government and the Leibniz Foundation now run it as a place to have informatics seminars. And it's in computer science, it's very prestigious to get a Dagstuhl seminar. So a number of people who organized this seminar, including Yvonne Herman from the W3C, who you're probably very familiar with, Bill, and a number of people from that group, and also they sort of intermingled this other thread, this beyond the PDF meetings that were organized by Phil Bourne, who, if you don't know him, he was one of the founders of a very important biomedical repository called Protein Data Bank, and he just left the NIH, where he was in charge of data science, to start to run the Data Science Institute at University of Virginia. He organized these beyond the PDF meetings, and so we sort of had this sort of interdigitation of people from these different meetings, and we all sort of decided that, geez, it would be good to just keep this going, right? We had these great discussions, people had all these ideas, and when you have a Dagstuhl seminar, you're kind of required, or if it's the kind that we ran, you're required to have a manifesto or white paper that comes out of it, and we had one with about 1 million ideas in it, some of which were carried forward. So we have 2,200 members, or about. It doesn't cost anything to join, although you're encouraged to contribute something. And often people end up contributing a lot of sweat equity. I think I probably paid dues of about $1 million a year to the foundation on that basis. 11 currently active working groups. So we came out with this manifesto, as I mentioned, back in 2011. And if you go back and read it, it's full of all kinds of ideas about how to sort of break out of the confines of the PDF and allow new kinds of content to be developed and how to help people do their scholarship. And as I said, some of the ideas were carried forward. And we kind of evolved since then. I mean, we really bootstrapped this organization. The whole idea was developed for having this organization around a picnic table outside of the Schloss. The domain name was purchased by David Schotten from Oxford on his mobile phone. It was very interesting. So, and we're very lean organization. So here are some key accomplishments of this super lean organization. The Joint Declaration of Data Citation Principles, the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, the Software Citation Principles, the Resource Identification Initiative, which helps, which many publishers are participating in, which helps definitively identify biological reagents, model organisms, strains. If you have a genetically engineered mouse, you cannot reproduce the experiment unless that person's experiment, unless you know exactly where to get exactly that mouse. So those kinds of things are captured in RID. We developed the data citation mods for JATS 1.1 and other things. The most recent thing and the thing that I've been mostly involved in has been data citation. Some active working groups, the Scholarly Commons Project, the Annotating All Knowledge Project, which Bill mentioned. And I'll also mention that Annotating All Knowledge kind of came out of some discussions between Marianne Martone, who's a former president of FORCE-11, and the head of Hypothesis, and some other folks. But how did Hypothesis get started, and how did all that happen? And before Hypothesis, there was a working group at W3C on developing this web annotation model. How did that get started? It got started with discussion between Yvonne Herman and a couple of other folks and myself at the Schloss-Dogsville meeting. Okay? And it turned out that there were some folks at Los Alamos and at UIUC and some other places working on annotation approaches for humanities documents, and my group and some other folks at Elsevier were working on, and Eli Lilly actually were working on doing this for STEM documents. And we thought maybe we ought to get together, and we started the community group, and it really took off, and now you have a whole other thing, right? So that's great. So why is FORCE-11 different from something like RDA, or is it just another thing like RDA? It's not really. We have over time we evolved, and it's not very much time, we evolved this sort of multi-stage model of going from principles, agreement on principles, to adoption. And it has these stages, as I've outlined: principles, specification, pilot, roadmap, adoption. I'm going to try to walk you through an example of that using data citation. Well, actually, before I do that, I'll just mention, people familiar with the idea of data citation? Anybody want to tell me why it could be important in science? I'm grading you. Why could it be important in science to cite data? Well, citing data is really not so much about citing the data as it's about requiring people to archive it robustly and make it accessible. Digitization has allowed enormous volumes of data to be created in science, and unlike the original kind of scientific revolution model developed in philosophical transactions of the Royal Society and so forth, where the idea was you're going to show your data, you're going to explain exactly how you derive the results, and then you're going to base your conclusions on data, which was quite revolutionary. Well, that's still in place, but in many instances, that data, the primary data is really not available. And it leads to situations where it can't be validated, the conclusions can't be validated, the data can't be reused. So people got very interested in treating primary data as a first-class scholarly object. And there were folks at the National Academies and CODATA and the Library of Congress who were really interested, and they published these voluminous reports about this topic. And a number of us were discussing this, well, including these folks, and they were concerned that these reports would become shelfware, right? As many government and large organization reports somehow seem to do, right? And so we wanted to find a way to bring them forward. And this is something that Marianne Martone organized. Was a series of meetings, including the kind of a big powwow and a lot of conference calls, to kind of harmonize all these reports into 9 recommendations, right? So, which we published, and there are now over 100 organizational endorsements of these principles. There was a discussion after these principles were published about what we were going to do, and there was some folks that thought, okay, we're done. We brought all these guys together, we got them to agree, and now somebody is going to go off and do this in some way, shape, or form. And some of us thought perhaps we should be the ones that sort of catalyze this because we know more about that. We've been all involved in this data citation principles effort ourselves. So we sort of developed a group to start working on what are the prerequisites to how would you actually implement all these principles? And so for example, we organized a meeting at the British Library to bring a bunch of publishers together with the creators of JATS and worked out what had to be done to add data citation capability to JATS. And Jeff Beck from the Library of Medicine and Debbie LaPierre from Mulberry actually took that forward and took it into the JATS committee, and now it's part of, it's a NISO standard. We worked on accessibility issues, so how do you actually have machine level accessibility of cited data in archives and have that in a sort of common format. And we worked in common with some publishers in an RDA group on workflows. We then started a pilot project that was focusing on biomedical data. It was funded and still is funded by the NIH. And we developed roadmaps for the project. So for actually getting to data citation. So also compact identifiers. Many specialized biomedical repositories do not issue DOIs. And we thought, okay, that's going to be a blocking factor because it's not that it's a particularly arcane technology, but these folks are not, just because we tell them it's a good idea, not going to re-engineer their systems or set up their systems. But they often, and it's sort of informally used this sort of prefix colon accession number model of identifiers that is very similar to the XML Curie model. And so we thought, well, let's work out a standard for resolving those. So we did. And it's now an agreement between the California Digital Library and the European Bioinformatics Institute, and we're hoping, we're working with NIH on this now. So who's involved? So a lot of big publishers and a lot of people that you would want to be involved with infrastructure. Are these, in some cases, these are more or less formal commitments, but more, so the CDL and the EBI and NIH have been hugely involved. CODATA is on the executive committee. But in a way, the way that we've sort of done this is not by negotiating at the top levels, but by finding people, by just attracting people who are really, really interested in moving this within their organizations and coming together with other people in other organizations and starting to develop this kind of work actually lifts their profile in their organizations and starts to get a bit more interest in what's going on. institutionally. So, as I said, we did the joint declaration in 2014. We then, we standardized the JATS, or helped standardize the JATS 1.1 data citation extensions. We then published a whole specification or guidance on how you get machine accessibility of cited data. And then we started this implementation pilot as a funded NIH project. The way we did this is we divided up the work into expert groups, and we kind of did this a little bit top down. Anybody could join the group that wanted to, but the folks who started the pilot, and myself and Marianne included, sort of picked people that we thought were willing experts to kind of lead these teams. And then we just said, go for it. And so we had people from Elsevier and Springer Nature leading the publisher's roadmap development. Springer Nature very kindly funded the workshop on their campus, including a bunch of travel to bring people together to develop this. We organized and funded a group to meet in San Diego to standardize all the repository metadata development, and that's now been aligned with schema.org by having Dan Brickley and Natasha Noy from Google and schema.org participate. And one of the early results, this was a press release from Elsevier in November, is that they actually implemented this model for 1,800 journals. We're expecting quite a few additional journals or publishers to come on board. I think you would have heard something from Springer Nature a little before now, except this person, Amy Canal, had to take a little short break to have a baby. So her energy of coordinating this work was sort of diminished, but she'll be back next month. Staffing and funding for FORCE-11. 1 full-time equivalent plus volunteers. And we have contractors that do our website. And we get grant funding. So that's important because it's not all volunteers. Let's say that, so I did a fair amount of work, and Marianne did as well, and some other folks on the data citation implementation pilot. That was funded by NIH, so we get a very generous, probably 5% of our salary to help with that. It's probably 5% of what we put in, too, in terms of time and effort. We get donations, some donations, and we do conferences every year or so. We're having our 2017 conference in Berlin in October, and these are pretty lively conferences. They're close to being unconferences. And I think people who've gone to these has anybody been to a FORCE meeting? No, you have. Did you like it?
Of course.
Yeah, good.
Everyone?
Yeah, good. Another really innovative thing I think that we're doing is the Scholarly Communications Institute, which is a joint project of FORCE-11 and University of California, San Diego. It's a summer institute, not a conference, a week-long intensive summer training program in next-generation scholarly communications with courses by experts in the field. And one of the things that we're going to do in the middle of that, there's courses. We will have a data citation course. We will also have a software citation course led by Dan Katz from NCSA. And in the middle, we'll actually have a hackathon for people who work at scholarly data repositories to implement our metadata specs on their data landing pages. But there's a lot more to it than this sort of techno-geek things that I just mentioned. So, so really, you know, administrators and librarians and all of the sort of disciplines in the field are represented in, and hopefully you'll check this out. It's on force11.org, and you'll see this prominently advertised, and we'd really like to invite everybody to consider attending. It's also in a lovely location on the beach. Lovely location. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, before we get to the questions, I said that I work on Alzheimer's disease. Why the heck would I care about any of this stuff? There are 40 million people in the world with Alzheimer's disease. Is there a cure? No. There have been over 400 clinical trials in the last decade on Alzheimer's disease. One of them succeeded. It was for a drug called memantine, which is given typically to Alzheimer's patients. It improves their symptoms for a while. It doesn't stop the disease progressing. So we feel that one of the big problems is, first of all, too many false positives in the scholarly record. That's really been recognized in a lot of studies. A lot of conflicting theories, hypotheses. People are pursuing the wrong pharmaceutical targets. And we'd like to be able to have all the primary data at our fingertips to integrate and apply to this problem. So I've worked a lot on the data citation problem for that very reason. And I think other people have similar kind of motivations. We want to cure diseases, and we think that improving the way that people create and produce and distribute and consume knowledge is essential to that. Okay, any questions?